The government. You know, that thing that keeps sending me letters saying I owe them taxes or whatever. I know this might be shocking, but we actually can't always trust the government. Sometimes they cover up stuff. They do things they shouldn't be doing and then they hide it. So this iceberg is gonna go into those cover-ups. Subscribe to the channel for more videos, follow my Instagram, and join my Discord for fun. And I also have a Patreon now with exclusive videos and stuff like that, where you actually get to vote on the videos I do. So if you have a topic you want me to cover, go ahead and join that Patreon. But let's get straight into this iceberg, starting with Layer 1, Area 51. Area 51 wasn't on any official map until the CIA admitted its existence in 2013, but the site has been operating as a flight test center since the mid-1950s. Originally known in CIA documents as Groom Lake, which I was personally very excited to hear that because that's what I thought they called my bathtub, the base was set up in 1955 to develop and test the U-2 reconnaissance plane under Project Aquatone. For years, every single reference to Groom Lake was heavily redacted. In 1994, the first pilot to fly the U-2, Francis Gary Powers, testified before Congress that he had to land on a dry lake bed near Groom Lake after being shot down over the Soviet Union. But at the time, nobody outside a handful of officials really understood why that remote patch of Nevada desert was so critical. A deeper cover-up came to light when, in July and August 2013, the CIA declassified two sets of documents that revealed not only the U-2 program, but also the subsequent A-12 Oxcart program, which was even more secretive. These documents showed that Groom Lake was where the Oxcart, an aircraft capable of flying over Mach 3 at 80,000 feet, underwent its earliest test flights. The base's runways, maintenance hangars, and even its security protocols were designed so that no photographs or blueprints would ever make it into public hands. According to the declassified U-2 history, the site had multiple camouflaged hangars right from 1955, and road signs directing military personnel to, quote, restricted area 4808. Locals were hired as cattle ranchers or truck drivers, but they were fingerprinted, bonded, and sworn to secrecy, with any slip of information punishable by heavy fines under the Atomic Energy Act, even though the site had absolutely nothing to do with nuclear weapons. Then there's Bob Lazar, who in 1989 gave an interview claiming he worked in a facility called S4 just south of Area 51. Lazar said he was reverse engineering alien technology, specifically gravity-defying flying discs. His story included precise details about an Element 115 power source, which at the time, physicists hadn't synthesized. Critics quickly pointed out that Lazar's claimed degrees from MIT and Caltech didn't check out. There's no record of him at either institution. Still, in 2019, scientists actually created a highly unstable isotope of moscovium, which is element 115, though it decays in milliseconds and really couldn't power spacecrafts the way that Lazar described. Despite that Lazar controversy, many insiders and declassified records confirmed that Area 51 was home to a string of black projects. The F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter first flew there in 1981 under the codename Have Blue. Employees who worked on Have Blue were sworn to something called Q clearance, a classification even beyond top secret. In a 2005 Forbes interview with a former employee, the test uniforms at Groom Lake had badges that simply read DT for defense test, and nobody was ever told which branch of government they worked for. This level of compartmentalization meant that if someone had happened to see a prototype jet or a strange circular shape hangar, their supervisors would simply respond with Black Project, shutting down any further questions. MLK. Okay, you probably already know the basic story. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were suspicious of Martin Luther King Jr. from early on. But the reality is that they ran an extensive covert campaign to undermine him. Starting around 1956, the FBI opened a file on King, initially under the pretext of investigating possible communist ties. Over the next decade, they amassed more than 14,000 pages of surveillance records, including wiretap transcripts, informant reports, and internal memos. In one infamous 1964 memo, Hoover explicitly ordered his agents to focus on discrediting King's personal life. telling them to, quote, expose his philandering. Which, guys, I'm be real, whenever I wrote the script, I did not know what the word philander meant, but now I'm gonna start using that word a lot more. Oh, it means to, like, fuck other people. Like, it's like cheating, you know? It means readily or frequently enter into casual sexual relationships with women. I'm gonna put that on my Tinder bio. Red flag, I'm a philanderer. Oh, that's funny. Anyway, all of that led to FBI agents bugging hotel rooms and compiling logs of alleged affairs. In a 1964 internal document, agents detailed how they bugged a room at the Lorraine Motel 2 years before King would actually be there, and transcribed conversations suggesting extramarital activity. In addition to these phone taps, the FBI inserted informants into King's inner circle. One of the most notorious was William Turner, a preacher who secretly recorded conversations for the Bureau. Turner's notes, filed in FBI records, describe private meetings where King discussed strategy, information that the FBI then leaked selectively to friendly newspapers with hints about King's communist sympathies. Perhaps the most chilling episode occurred in November 1964 when an anonymous package arrived at King's home, along with a note reading, "King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have 10 days to do it." Inside was an audio tape assembled from those hotel bugs, edited to sound like it captured a sexual encounter. The letter and tape were the FBI's attempt to push King to unaliving himself. When King was assassinated in April 1968, the official investigation by the FBI and Memphis police appeared to brush aside any suggestion of a wider conspiracy. But in 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the case. That association, known as the HSCA, reviewed previously withheld FBI files and brought in acoustic scientists who concluded there was a high possibility of a second gunshot, a finding that directly contradicted the FBI's claim of a lone assassin. David Garrow, in his 1981 biography called Bearing the Cross, uses FBI memos from 1967 showing that Hoover was already labeling King a liar and a hypocrite, and that he personally signed off on surveillance orders. Later, during the 1980s and 90s, another scholar, Claiborne Carson, was part of the team that managed the King Papers project at Stanford. Carson and his colleagues combed through the FBI files and discovered redacted passages suggesting Hoover had direct knowledge of King's movements, sometimes day by day, and withheld critical leads that might have linked other suspects to the assassination. MK Ultra. MK Ultra was a secret CIA program in the 1950s and 60s aimed at figuring out how to control minds. Agents tested everything from LSD and other drugs to sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and even fake therapies on people, often without even telling them what was happening. The goal was to learn if these methods could create reliable spies or extract information from unwilling subjects. Many of the records were deliberately shredded around 1973, but a few surviving documents surfaced during a 1975 Senate investigation led by Senator Frank Church. Those reports reveal that experiments took place in universities, prisons, and hospitals, and that some participants suffered lasting psychological harm. In the end, the program was officially shut down in 1973, but the mix of destroyed evidence, coerced subjects, and ongoing secret leads kept MKUltra on the list of major government cover-ups. Chernobyl. When Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded on April 26, 1986, Soviet authorities initially tried to downplay the scale of the disaster. Local officials only told people living nearby to stay indoors, without saying why, and Moscow waited almost 2 days before admitting that a serious accident had occurred. Even then, they insisted the reactor was intact and blamed the situation on equipment failures rather than human error. It wasn't until Swedish radiation detectors picked up unusually high levels and pressured the Soviet Union to explain what was happening that they finally acknowledged a reactor meltdown. In those first critical hours, thousands of people in nearby towns like Pripyat weren't evacuated. Many got exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Over the following weeks, Soviet scientists and firefighters scrambled to build a concrete sarcophagus to contain the wrecked reactor. But the initial cover-up and delayed evacuation made the health and environmental damage much worse than it might have been. Tiananmen Square. In the spring of 1989, thousands of students and other protesters gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, demanding political reform and greater freedom. The Chinese government allowed the demonstrations to continue for several weeks, but behind the scenes, they planned a crackdown. On the night of June 3rd to 4th, the military was ordered to clear the square. Tanks rolled in and troops opened fire on unarmed civilians. Inside China, state media never showed the footage or admitted what happened. The official line was that counter-revolutionary riots were under control. Foreign journalists, meanwhile, captured images of students standing in front of tanks and hundreds of bodies lining the street. To this day, Chinese authorities heavily censor any mention of the crackdown. Social media posts are deleted, foreign websites are blocked, and families of victims face harassment if they try to hold memorials. Estimates of how many people died vary widely, from a few hundred up to several thousand, because the government destroyed or withheld key records. Project Stargate. Project Stargate was a US government program that ran from the 1970s until the mid-1990s to investigate remote viewing, the idea that certain people could physically see events happening far away. Initially sponsored by the Army and later overseen by the CIA, Stargate paid psychics, often referred to as viewers, to describe military targets, hidden bases, or other classified information. Scientists at the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, including Harold Puthoff and Ingo Swann, ran controlled experiments where viewers tried to sketch secret buildings or report troop movements. For years, intelligence officers believed even a small success might be worth it. But after dozens of tests and millions of dollars spent, a 1995 CIA review concluded that the results weren't reliable enough to be of real use. Most of the documents, reports, transcripts, and funding requests were declassified afterwards, showing that while the program generated a lot of hype, it never produced consistently accurate intelligence. Funding was cut in 1995, and the official files make Stargate a textbook example of a cover-up born more from wishful thinking than actual results. That was Layer 1, guys, so let's get into Layer 2, and from here on out, they get a lot more unwell known. Like, I pretty much knew all the ones in Layer 1, and starting here, I really didn't know any of these. The Boys on the Tracks. In June 1982, two 14-year-old boys, William Billy Wayne Daniels and James Jimmy Howland, were found dead on a set of railroad tracks on the outskirts of Tulsa, Oklahoma. At first glance, it looked like a tragic accident. Both boys had alcohol in their system and they were lying in wet clothes on the tracks. Law enforcement quickly closed the case as just boys who fell asleep drunk and got run over by a train. But from the start, family members and friends thought something didn't add up. Both Billy and Jimmy were good kids who weren't prone to heavy drinking, and there were no signs of alcohol-related stupor beyond a single beer each. Their bodies also showed bruises and sand in places that suggested that they'd been in a struggle before they ended up on the tracks. As more people raised questions, local investigators quietly buried any leads pointing to foul play. Witnesses who claimed they saw cars circling the area that night or heard screaming were never interviewed in depth. Rumors spread that the boys had been lured to the tracks because they'd witnessed something they shouldn't have, possibly related to corrupt dealings by a powerful county commissioner's associates. Instead of following those leads, law enforcement just stuck to the accident narrative, refusing to test crucial evidence, such as clothing fibers or scrape marks on nearby fencing that might have recorded a scuffle. Amid growing public unease, the district attorney's office refused to reopen the case, citing lack of definitive proof that anyone else was involved. In reality, investigators deliberately ignored medical examiner notes indicating that the boys had only been on the tracks for a short time before impact, and that their injuries weren't consistent with simply falling asleep. In 2001, thanks to pressure from local journalists and civil rights activists, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation finally agreed to re-examine the file. While they confirmed that many original investigators had indeed missed or ignored key details, the trail had gone cold. Critical evidence had been lost or, quote, accidentally destroyed, and several witnesses had moved away or died. died. In the end, the OSBI closed its reinvestigation without naming any suspects, stating that there wasn't enough physical evidence to prosecute anyone. To this day, family members and community advocates insist that local law enforcement conspired to hide a politically motivated crime. This one's crazy. There's like a Wendigoon video on it. Go watch that one after this if you want, because it's like goes way more in depth. It's fucking crazy. I mean, this one is fucking crazy. The Tuskegee study. Between 1932 and 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service, or PHS, in collaboration with the Tuskegee Institute, conducted what's widely known now as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Researchers enrolled roughly 600 black men from Macon County, Alabama, 399 of which already had syphilis and 201 who did not, as part of a study allegedly designed to observe untreated syphilis. Participants were told they were receiving, quote, free healthcare for, quote, bad blood, a local catch-all for a category of ailments, but they were never informed that they had syphilis. For 40 years, PHS doctors not only failed to treat these men once penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis in the late 1940s, but they actively withheld that information. Instead, participants received placebos such as aspirin and mineral supplements, and were subjected to invasive spinal taps under the guise of special treatments. The federal government's cover-up worked on multiple levels. First, researchers deliberately recruited impoverished sharecroppers knowing that they would be less likely to question authority. Second, PHS officials misled local community leaders and the men themselves about the true purpose of the procedures they underwent. Third, government reports and medical journals published during the 1940s and 50s referred to the study as a benign epidemiological study, omitting any mention of withheld treatment. Even when penicillin became cheap and widely available after World War II, the PHS decided that treating the subjects would ruin the integrity of the study. That's fucking crazy, bro. They said that treating these people would ruin their study. Then a 1947 memo from lead investigator Dr. Raymond Vonderlehr explicitly states, quote, the study cannot be of value if subjects are treated too early. By 1953, when the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention took over oversight, nobody moved to stop the unethical withholding of treatment. The men were effectively used as guinea pigs to trace the natural progression of untreated syphilis, even as public health guidelines had already shifted to treat every diagnosed case. It wasn't until July 1972, after a whistleblower leaked the details to reporters at the Associated Press, that the full horror of the Tuskegee study emerged into the national spotlight. Congressional hearings swiftly followed, revealing internal PHS memos where researchers celebrated their ability to keep the study hidden from both participants and the broader medical community. That same year, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the surviving subjects and the heirs of those who had died. In 1973, the federal government settled for $10 million and promised lifetime medical benefits and burial services to study participants and their families. But beyond financial compensation, the scandal forced a reckoning. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act, which mandated informed consent, and created the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, system to oversee any future human subjects research. Nearly 50 years later, the Tuskegee study remains one of the most egregious examples of a government cover-up that sacrificed human lives in the name of science. Teapot Dome Scandal. In the early 1920s, under President Warren G. Harding's administration, the US government secretly leased federally owned oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, to private oil companies without competitive bidding. The arrangement became public knowledge thanks to a few investigative journalists, but the scope of the corruption was initially obscured by high-ranking officials within the Department of the Interior, most notably Secretary Albert B. Fall. Between 1921 and 1922, Fall took more than $400,000 in loans and gifts, about $6 million in today's money, from oil magnates Harry Sinclair and Edward Doherney, in exchange for control of the strategic oil fields, originally set aside for the Navy's use in emergencies. Roswell. It all kicked off in early July 1947, about 75 miles northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. when rancher W.W. Mac Brazel discovered odd debris scattered across his sheep pasture. Strips of rubber-like material, tinfoil, and sticks of balsa wood. He reported it to the local sheriff, who in turn alerted the Roswell Army Airfield, or RAAF. On July 8th, the RAAF issued a press release stating they'd recovered a quote flying disc, sparking nationwide excitement and outright panic for some. Lieutenant Walter Hott, the base public information officer, even drafted a memo stating the wreckage was quote flight equipment of a disc. But by that afternoon, Brigadier General Roger Ramey held a press conference rebranding the debris as a weather balloon. Photographs taken then show Major Jesse Marcel holding pieces of what appear to be newspaper, aluminum foil, and wood. Marcel himself would later say he knew that the debris didn't look like anything Earth-based. What the US military never admitted publicly back then, but only revealed decades later, was that the wreckage was part of Project Mogul, a top-secret program designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests using high-altitude balloons carrying sensitive acoustic sensors. That entire program remained classified until the late 1970s. In the meantime, eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen strange metallic materials or even alien bodies at the crash site were either ignored or asked to stay silent. By the late 1970s, UFO researchers like Stanton Friedman and journalist William Moore began digging into Rancher Brazel's account and interviewing Major Marcel. Their work, plus the emergence of several locals who said they saw military personnel loading debris into sealed trucks, fueled public suspicion that the government was covering up something far bigger than just a downed balloon. In 1994, the US Air Force finally published the Roswell Report Case Closed, asserting that the debris was indeed from a Mogul balloon. 2 years later, they released a follow-up study clarifying that reports of alien bodies likely stemmed from misidentified test dummies used in high-altitude parachute experiments. But by then, the Roswell case had taken on a life of its own in pop culture. Books, documentaries, and endless conspiracy theories. Many still believe the government destroyed or hid key evidence. Helicopter flight logs, detailed lab analyses, and first-hand witness accounts to protect a genuine extraterrestrial find. While the official story insists it was all about nuclear test surveillance, the sheer volume of conflicting testimonies, destroyed documents, and delayed declassifications makes Roswell a textbook example of a cover-up that thrives on secrecy and selective disclosure. Ruby Ridge. In August 1992, an 8-day siege unfolded at Randy Weaver's remote cabin near Naples, Idaho, now notorious as Ruby Ridge. It began when US Marshals tried to arrest Weaver on a warrant for missing a court summons tied to a firearms charge. Surveillance teams set up high in the nearby woods, watching Weaver's property. On August 21st, 2 marshals approached Weaver's son Samuel and family friend Kevin Harris near the cabin. A firefight erupted. Marshal William Deegan and Samuel Weaver were both killed. That night, the FBI took command of the operation under rules written by Deputy Attorney General Jamie Gorelick. Those rules, later called the Rules of Engagement, stated that any armed adult male seen in the vicinity could be considered hostile and shot on sight, a departure from standard US law enforcement policy. On August 22nd, FBI sniper Lon Haruchi fatally shot Randy Weaver's wife, Vicky, as she stood behind their 6-year-old daughter, sending a wave of outrage through the nation. Vicky was unarmed and holding the child at the time. The next day, Weaver surrendered along with Harris, and eventually Randy and Kevin Harris were charged with multiple crimes, including murder. Here's where the cover-up really kicks in. Initial FBI reports claimed Haruchi had no clear line of sight to Vicky when he fired, suggesting the shot was accidental. But internal memos that were later disclosed contradicted that, showing that agents knew Vicky was a non-combatant standing in the open. Other documents revealed that some surveillance footage was withheld, and the infamous rules of engagement, orders basically authorizing unlawful use of deadly force, were kept under wraps during the first weeks of public scrutiny. It wasn't until a 1993 Senate Judiciary Committee hearing that the Justice Department had to admit those rules existed, prompting widespread condemnation. By the time Randy Weaver's trial began in 1993, the defense argued government misconduct so extreme it had essentially provoked the violence. Weaver was acquitted of murder charges and convicted only on the original firearms-related counts. Haruchi was later charged with manslaughter in the state of Idaho, but the case was dismissed, citing sovereign immunity arguments with the federal government. In 1995, Weaver received a $100,000 settlement from the US government for wrongful death and wrongful arrest claims, and the government paid Harris $1 million. Still, many records from the operation remain pretty heavily redacted or classified. Pentagon Papers. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara commissioned a secret 47-volume study of US political and military involvement in Vietnam, stretching all the way back to World War II. The resulting Pentagon Papers revealed that multiple administrations, from Truman through Johnson, had consistently misled the public about the scope and prospects of the war. Top officials, including Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, knew that American forces were unlikely to achieve a decisive victory, yet they continued to escalate troop deployments and bombing campaigns in Southeast Asia. The study was classified top secret with special caveats. Even congressional oversight committees weren't fully informed of its content. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst who had worked on the study, became disillusioned and decided to leak portions of it to the New York Times. On June 13, 1971, the Times began publishing a series of front-page articles based on the papers. The Nixon administration immediately filed for an injunction, trying to block further publication on grounds of national security. This led to one of the most important Supreme cases in First Amendment history, New York Times v. United States. On June 30th, 1971, the court ruled 6-3 that the government had not met the, quote, heavy burden of truth needed to show that publication would cause inevitable, direct, and immediate harm to national security. That decision forced the Washington Post and dozens of other newspapers to publish their own excerpts, fully exposing the lies. U.S. Biowarfare Test. The U.S. military's biological warfare testing program really ramped up after World War II, when fears of another global conflict drove researchers to explore every possible weapon, even microbes. At the center of it all was Fort Detrick in Maryland, which became the principal hub for research into anthrax, tularemia, and botulinum toxin. By the early 1950s, scientists there were working on ways to mass-produce Bacillus anthracis as an aerosol, meaning tiny particles that could be inhaled. And Bacillus anthracis is like what causes anthrax. Internal memos from that era, still heavily redacted today, show that researchers dragged live animals into sealed chambers, pumped in anthrax spores, and then tracked how long it took for the animals to die. Those same documents also reveal discussions about dispersing test agents over populated areas to see how far the clouds might drift. Despite occasional internal protests about the ethics and safety risks, the program was classified top secret, and officials routinely lied about the scope of their work when talking to Congress or local authorities. One of the most notorious episodes came in September 1950 with Operation Sea Spray. Under orders from the Navy's Special Projects Division, a small boat off the coast of San Francisco released a cloud of Serratia marcescens bacteria into the breeze for 2 nights straight. At the time, researchers treated Serratia as a harmless marker organism, easy to detect in swabs and assumed to have no lasting effects on humans. Their goal was to map how a biological cloud would move through a major city's air currents, but within days, area hospitals saw a spike in pneumonia cases. At least one patient developed a urinary tract infection traced back to Serratia, and some died, though officials later insisted those deaths weren't connected. Yeah, sure, buddy. For nearly 3 decades, the Navy denied any link between the tests and the illnesses. Victims and local doctors didn't learn the truth until the early 1980s, when FOIA released documents finally revealed Navy reports acknowledging both the spread of Serratia in hospitals materials and the likelihood that people were harmed. Still, no one was ever held accountable, and to this day, many of the lab notebooks and sampling data remain classified. While sea spray was aimed at civilians, Project SHAD, or Shipboard Hazard and Defense, targeted US military personnel. Starting in 1962, Project SHAD ran more than 100 separate shipboard exercises where unwitting sailors were exposed to live or simulated bioweapon agents. One mission involved spraying Bacillus globigii, which is a stand-in for anthrax, onto ships docked in San Diego Bay to see how quickly survivors could detect it. Another trial released vaporized Brucella Suisse near training camps in Virginia. These operations often took place without clear consent. Many service members were told they were taking part in routine readiness drills, not experiments involving potentially deadly germs. When Congress launched the Project SHAD Sunshine Project in the early 2000s, veterans came forward reporting chronic respiratory ailments, skin rashes, and neurological symptoms. Although the Department of Defense later admitted that some tests used real agents like tularemia and rice blast fungus, it still downplayed the health risks. Many records about who was exposed, the exact dosages, and follow-up medical data were destroyed in the late 1970s, ostensibly to, quote, protect national security, making it nearly impossible for victims to prove cause and effect. Meanwhile, Operation White Coat ran from 1954 to 1973 in Fort Detrick's Medical Research Division, presenting itself as a humane alternative because the volunteers were U.S. Army conscientious objectors, primarily Seventh-day Adventists who agreed to be injected with pathogens in exchange for fulfilling service requirements. Subjects were exposed to agents like the one that causes Q fever, Rift Valley fever virus, and again tularemia. Participants were housed in isolation wards where doctors deliberately monitored their symptoms, recorded fever spikes, and took countless blood samples. Afterward, volunteers received antibiotic treatment, sometimes only after they'd already fallen extremely ill. Although these men technically gave consent, they had limited bargaining power once enlisted, and many reported long-term health issues, like fatigue, joint pain, and recurrent fevers, and these all only came to light years later. Government reports claimed full recoveries, but internal correspondence suggests researchers manipulated data to make it look like no one suffered lasting effects. When the program ended in 1973, official releases celebrated White Coat as a triumph of science and ethics. In reality, thousands of pages of raw data were shredded, and follow-up studies on former volunteers' health were never pursued, leaving serious questions about how many lives were quietly damaged or derailed by these experiments. And that was Layer 2, guys. Let's get into Layer 3 now. Starting with Agent Orange. During the Vietnam War from 1961 to 1971, the US military sprayed millions of gallons of a herbicide called Agent Orange over forests and farmlands to remove jungle cover and crops that might sustain enemy fighters. Its active ingredient, dioxin, is a highly toxic chemical that sticks around in soil and water for years. Initially, the government and chemical companies like Dow and Monsanto denied any long-term harm, claiming the tests on animals and brief human studies showed no lasting risks. But as early as the late 1960s, internal USDA and Army reports highlighted serious birth defects in animals exposed to dioxin, and field workers noted that skin diseases and respiratory problems seemed more common among people handling the herbicide. By the early 1970s, soldiers and Vietnamese civilians began reporting chronic illnesses, cancers, neurological disorders, and severe birth defects in children born long after the spraying stopped. Despite mounting evidence, the military continued to classify many documents related to the testing and handling of Agent Orange top secret, delaying public scrutiny. It wasn't until 1978 that Congress passed the Veterans Dioxin and Radiation Exposure Compensation Standards Act, pushing the Department of Veteran Affairs, or VA, to review thousands of claims. Around the same time, Nixon appointed judge Jack Weinstein presided over a class action lawsuit in 1984, which eventually settled for $180 million. Not an admission of guilt, but a way to avoid trial. Internal memos from Monsanto released later showed executives knew by 1965 that their animal tests linked dioxin to cancer and birth defects, yet they kept marketing Agent Orange as safe. In Vietnam, the cover-up was even more devastating. US officials in the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, government largely ignored the health crisis among rural populations. Villagers living in sprayed areas were assured plain water would wash off any residue, even though lab tests indicated dioxin could bind to the skin and enter the body. Information about contaminated rice paddies and fish was suppressed. Local doctors who tried to document birth defects risked losing their jobs. After the war, many of these records were repatriated to American archives, and Vietnamese researchers faced heavy bureaucratic hurdles getting foreign scientists to investigate. It wasn't until the 1990s that joint US-Vietnam studies confirmed elevated dioxin levels in human tissue samples and hotspots of soil contamination around former US bases. Gulf of Tonkin Incident. In August 1964, two alleged attacks on US Navy destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, near North Vietnam triggered a major escalation of the Vietnam War. On August 2nd, the Maddox was patrolling in international waters off the North Vietnamese coast when North Vietnamese torpedo boats made a run for it. US forces reported shooting back, and the Maddox emerged basically unscathed. At that point, the skirmish seemed like a standard Cold War era freedom of navigation patrol. But in the early hours of August 4th, US radar operators and sonar technicians on the Maddox and Turner Joy reported that they were under a second, much heavier attack. Admiral John McCain radioed that enemy patrol boats were closing in and the ships turned on full firepower. The Kennedy administration immediately released a statement claiming two unprovoked attacks on American vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin, painting it as North Vietnam's escalation. Within days, President Lyndon B. Johnson used those reports to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress on August 7th, 1964. This resolution gave the president virtually unlimited authority to intervene in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. But the truth unraveled slowly over the next few years. NSA intercepts and crew logs, still secret at the time, showed that the August 4th attack likely never even happened. Intercepts of North Vietnamese radio traffic indicated no patrol boats were even in the area, and sonar contact reports were probably misreadings or false echoes. Internal NSA memos from late 1964 and early 1965, declassified in the 80s and 90s, confirmed that analysts doubted any second engagement had even taken place. Grand Central Station secret tracks. Just beneath the hustle of commuters in New York City lies a hidden network of tracks most people never hear about. Grand Central Terminal officially opened in 1913, but even before that, planners included secret platforms and tunnels for high-profile or emergency use. The most famous is Track 61, tucked beneath the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. It was built in the 1930s for President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Instead of arriving at the main concourse and walking through crowds, risking exposure of his polio-related paralysis, he could be unloaded directly into a private elevator and whisked up to his suite. No public announcement marked its existence. Roosevelt's team paid for the final construction out of pocket, and the railroad agreed to seal off access points so no one could stumble across him rolling by in his wheelchair. Over the decades, very few people even knew Track 61 existed. Even some of Grand Central's own employees didn't realize there was a private platform hidden under Park Avenue. Beyond Roosevelt, the secret tracks served other discrete purposes during World War II. Officials worried about keeping troop movements under wraps, so military officers sometimes used the hidden platforms to board trains without drawing crowds or reporters. There are accounts of clandestine meetings between intelligence agents that took place in the unused rooms off those tracks. Union leaders also held private talks with railroad executives away from the public eye, sometimes negotiating mediating labor disputes when tensions were high, which helped avert strikes that could cripple wartime transportation. In each case, railroad managers worked quietly with government or military contacts, deliberately blocking or redacting records that would show who went there and when. When inspectors came through or historians later requested old track diagrams, the paperwork was often misplaced or given heavily redacted copies. By keeping those records secret, both the railroad and federal authorities made sure no one could trace how often those hidden tracks really got used or who else slipped through the tunnels in the middle of the night. Even today, the city's transit authorities and Metro North Railroad keep public discussion of Track 61 and related tunnels to a minimum. Occasional urban explorers or maintenance workers still say they've stumbled across sealed entrances, but official maps simply list them as just, quote, out of service, and tours never mention them. Because so many documents were shredded or classified over the decades, historians have had to piece together stories from oral interviews, scattered newspaper mentions, and a handful of declassified memos. That patchwork approach means some details remain murky. Who else used Track 61 after Roosevelt? Exactly how often the military relied on it, and whether any other hidden chambers exist beneath the terminal. In that sense, Grand Central's secret tracks stand as one of the city's longest-running cover-ups. A private world operating under millions of feet of commuters erased from most public records despite playing a key role in politics, war, and labor history. Karen Silkwood. In the early 1970s, Karen Silkwood worked as a chemical technician at the Kerr-McGee Cimarron fuel fabrication site in Crescent, Oklahoma, a plant that makes plutonium pellets for nuclear reactor fuel rods. Her job involved handling radioactive materials, and she quickly became aware of safety issues most employees didn't notice or they were just told to ignore. Silkwood kept a detailed log of glove box leaks, damaged respiratory equipment, and a pattern of coworkers getting sick. She reported these concerns internally, but plant supervisors dismissed her warnings, insisting that any contamination was minimal and within, quote, acceptable limits. At the time, Kerr-McGee had little incentive to share information. Regulators were stretched thin, and the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, often relied on the company's self-reporting rather than conducting independent inspections. By 1974, Silkwood joined the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union and became a vocal safety activist. She invited union officials into the plant to gather signed statements from coworkers corroborating her claims. In one meeting, a fellow technician told her that a piece of safety gear had been deliberately bypassed to save time, even though it exposed staff to higher radiation doses. Silkwood began taking crumbs of evidence, photographs of dirty equipment, copies of internal memos, and a few radiation swipes on safety gloves, all planning to turn them over to researchers or journalists. But as she dug deeper, Kerr-McGee ramped up pressure. Records show her key interviews were delayed or canceled, and at one point management accused her of spreading, quote, false rumors. She faced harassment on the job, unannounced drug tests, sudden changes in shift assignments, and even threats suggesting her family could face retaliation. On November 13th, 1974, Silkwood was on her way to meet a New York Times reporter about the documents she collected when her car veered off a rural road near Ralston, Oklahoma, and crashed. The circumstances still raise questions. Witnesses said her car bounced over a, quote, cat's eye reflector strip on the highway, causing it to spin off the road at exactly the point where visibility was clear and no other vehicles were nearby. Silkwood suffered serious head injuries and later died in the hospital. When journalists finally got hold of her safety records and glove box swipe results after her death, they showed radiation levels far above what Kerr-McGee had publicly reported, even after Silkwood had reportedly tested positive for contamination the night before her drive. Company data from that same time period was missing pages or used inconsistent units, making it impossible to verify how bad the leaks had been or how long management knew about them. In the months after her death, Kerr-McGee mounted a public relations campaign stating that Silkwood had been careless with her safety procedures and that the hit-and-run findings showed, quote, no evidence evidence of foul play. They emphasized that she had a high alcohol level in her blood, though toxicology reports later contradicted that claim. The AEC's internal review, meant to investigate whether plant safety was subpar, pinned heavily on Kerr-McGee's own records, many of which had already been scrubbed or were incomplete. Silkwood's family filed a lawsuit against the company, arguing that she died because of an intentional cover-up meant to silence her. In 1975, a jury awarded her estate $10.5 million, finding that the company had acted willfully and fraudulently. Still, the amount was later reduced on appeal and no criminal charges were ever brought against the company officials or anyone else. Records kept by Kerr-McGee about their internal investigations remain sealed in many respects, and questions about whether Silkwood's car was tampered with or if she was followed from the plant linger. So I guess we'll never know. And that was the government cover-ups iceberg, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Now, do you guys want a part 2? Because there's a lot more cover-ups that I can cover. If you guys want to see more of this, let me know. I'd love to do a part 2 of this video. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you for watching. Subscribe. Everybody have a great night. Sweet dreams.